The water came in the night, the way trouble usually did. Quietly at first, then, all at once. She heard it before she saw it. A low, steady, rushing beneath the rain, a sound with too much weight behind it to be ordinary runoff. She lay still in the dark and listened, and what she heard told her everything about how the morning would look. 6 years of traveling roads that flooded, of reaching farmhouses hours too late, of reading weather the way some women read scripture. It all translated the sound for her without asking. She rose before dawn, pulled on her coat and her boots, and stepped outside to meet what was coming. The brown water had already swallowed the low field east of her cabin. It moved with the slow, particular confidence of something that knows it has won. The creek that usually ran 10 feet wide along the property's southern edge had ceased to be a creek at all. It had simply become part of everything else, an idea absorbed into a larger idea. She stood at the edge of her porch and watched the water feel its way through the tall grass, and behind her the mule shifted and blew a long breath through his nose. He was gray around the muzzle now, patient in the way of creatures who have seen enough not to be surprised, and he pressed his forehead briefly against her shoulder as she reached back to steady him. She already knew about the bridge. She had walked that bridge just 4 days ago on her way to gather cattail roots along the bank, and she had noticed then how the spring melt had swollen the creek's shoulders, how the water ran murky and fast and close to the first planking. She had thought, 2 more days of rain and that bridge will not hold. She had thought it and walked home and said it to no one, because there was no one who would have taken the observation as anything other than another reason to distrust her. She had been in the settlement 4 months, long enough to know the names of the streets, the schedule of the supply wagon, the particular way the schoolhouse bell sounded on Sunday mornings when the wind ran east. Not long enough for any of it to feel like hers. The families here knew what the families in the last town had said about her, and that was enough. She had learned not to expect more. So she stood in the cold spring morning and watched the water rise, and she thought about the bridge 3 miles south, and the doctor 7 miles beyond it, and she did the arithmetic quickly, the way she always did, the way you learned to when every calculation had a life attached to it. 11 children in the schoolhouse yesterday. 3 of them coughing in a way she hadn't liked. The mule shifted again. The water crept another inch across the field. She was still standing there working through the numbers when the first knock came at her door. She let them knock a second time before she moved. Not from stubbornness, or not only from stubbornness, but because she had learned that the space between a knock and an answer told you something. People who knocked and waited were people who had thought about coming. People who knocked and immediately called out had come in a panic and would take a panicked answer from anyone. She needed to know which kind had come to her door before she opened it. But that is getting ahead of things. Before the knock, there was the road. Before the road, there was the last town. 4 months ago she had ridden out of Gracie Creek on the back of her mule in the early hours before any decent person was stirring, which was the only mercy they'd extended her. The darkness, the empty street, the absence of faces watching her go. She had not been given time to pack cleanly. She had taken what she could reach and what she could not leave, the tin of quinine, the willow bark, the lye soap, the roll of linen she kept fresh boiled and pressed. And the notebook. The formulary notebook her teacher had pressed into her hands years ago, its cover softened with use, its pages dense with dosages and observations written in 2 different hands, his and then hers, continuing on where his had left off. She had not planned to take any particular road. The mule had opinions, as he always did, and she had let him. He was 6 years old and gray already at the muzzle, and she trusted him in the way you trust something that has never lied to you. 3 days out from Gracie Creek in a thin rain, she had stopped at a crossroads and sat still for a long while. She wasn't weeping. She had done that the first night, alone in an empty field. And it had felt necessary, and then it had felt finished, and she had not done it again. What she was doing was quieter than weeping, and harder to name. She was listening to the silence where her life had been. She had delivered 41 children in 6 years. She had sat through fevers that should have taken the patient and guided them back by inches. She had not lost a child to her own error, not once, not ever, and she could say that plainly and without vanity, because it was simply what the record showed. What the record also showed, or what she had been told the record showed, was that the Aldridge boy's mother had died of a hemorrhage nothing could have stopped, and that the Aldridge family had needed someone to carry that grief, and she had been available, and without power enough to refuse it. At the crossroads in the rain, she had taken the notebook from her bag and opened it across the saddle. Not to read it, just to hold it, just to confirm that it was still there. The accumulated evidence that she knew things, had done things, and was not finished. The mule had turned northeast, and she had let him. The fever found the schoolhouse on a Tuesday, the way bad things often do, quietly through one child's flushed cheeks, and then another's almost politely, as though it had knocked before entering. By Wednesday noon, 4 children had been sent home. By Thursday morning, 7. And by Thursday evening, when the last of the gray light was bleeding out of the western sky and the floodwater still lay silver and flat across the lowland road, with no sign of retreating, the count had reached 11. 11 children. The schoolhouse sat on its slight rise above the town and looked, from a distance, almost peaceful. A single lamp burning in the window, a thin curl of smoke from the stovepipe. Up close it was something else. Mothers moved in and out with wet cloths and frightened eyes. 2 had sent their husbands south on horseback that morning. Both horses had come back muddy to the shoulder, the riders reporting the same thing in different words. The bridge was gone, the low road was gone, the water was still rising in the south field, and the doctor was 7 miles away and might as well have been 70. She knew none of this yet from any direct report. She knew it because she had been watching the water from her cabin door since Tuesday, the way she watched everything, with a particular quality of attention that was less pessimism than arithmetic. She had done the arithmetic. She had set her kit on the table and looked at it, the quinine, the willow bark tincture, the linen, the notebook, the soap. She had counted the days the water would likely need to recede. She had counted the children she had seen walking to the schoolhouse on Monday morning, some of them turning to look at her cabin as they passed, with that careful incuriosity children learn from their parents. She had been waiting for the knock since Wednesday. It came at dusk on Thursday. Not a knock precisely, more the sound of boots stopping on her step, and then a pause long enough that she knew the man was gathering himself before he used his hand. She opened the door before he could. He was a large man, the foreman from the settlement's main cattle operation, and he was holding his hat against his chest in both hands the way men hold hats when they are asking for something that costs them. He was not a man who looked comfortable asking. The water had come up over his boot tops at some point today, and the mud had dried in a pale line above his heel. He did not apologize. He did not offer an explanation or a preamble. He simply said that 11 children were sick in the schoolhouse, that the doctor could not get through, and that she was the only person within any reasonable distance who had ever managed a fever outbreak. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him at the darkening sky and the waterlogged flat of the eastern road, still gleaming dully in what remained of the light. She said she had conditions. He did not flinch exactly, but she saw the stillness that came over him. The kind a man produces when he is deciding whether to argue or endure. And she let it settle before she went on. The first condition was simple. She would have sole authority over the sick room, not consultation, not approval sought, and sometimes given, authority. What she said would be done when she said it, without committee or second-guessing from anyone standing in the doorway with an opinion they had not earned. He turned his hat in his hands. Around them, the night was coming in fast, the way it does after a flood, the sky gone deep blue-gray, and the ground still radiating cold water. Smell up through the boards of her step. He said he reckoned that was fair. She told him the second condition, the blacksmith. The settlement's blacksmith, the broad man, the one who had lost his boy 5 years back, the one who nodded to her in the street when no one was watching. She wanted him in that room as her witness, not to assist, not to decide, to witness. Every dose measured, every decision made, every instruction given, with him present and able to say so afterward. She had learned what it cost to work without a witness. She did not intend to learn it twice. The foreman looked at her for a long moment. She could see him recalibrating. This was not what he had expected. A woman with conditions, a woman who had named her price before she had even agreed to come. But she held his gaze and waited, and eventually he nodded and said he would go to the blacksmith now if she would be ready to leave directly after. She said she would. He left at a near jog across the wet yard, and she turned back inside to gather her kit. The mule was patient while she loaded him. He had been patient for 6 years, and she did not expect him to change. She laid the canvas satchel over his back, checked the straps. The tin of quinine powder, the willow bark tincture, the linen roll, the soap, the formulary, and when the two men came back across the field together, she was already standing at the gate. The blacksmith said nothing elaborate. He simply looked at her and said he understood the terms and agreed to them, and the steadiness in his voice told her that he had arrived at that agreement. Somewhere private, somewhere grief had already cleared the ground for it. He was not doing her a favor. He was doing what he wished someone had done before. They walked together, the three of them, through the last gray light of the evening, the mule's hooves pulling softly in the wet earth. Ahead, on its small rise, above the flooded road, the schoolhouse windows were lit, and even from this distance she could hear it. Not crying, not yet, but something quieter and more frightening. The particular hush of people waiting for someone to tell them what to do. The schoolhouse smelled of wet wool and lamp smoke, and the close, sour breath of sick children. She stood in the doorway for one full breath, long enough to count what she had and what she did not. And then she walked in. There were 7 mothers crowded into a room, built for 30 pupils. They had dragged the benches to the walls and laid the children on the floor on whatever they could find. Quilts, folded coats, a saddle blanket. A woman near the stove was wringing her hands rather than the cloth she held, which was neither cool nor clean. 2 of the children were shivering. One was very still. She moved to the still one first, crouched, pressed the back of her hand to the small forehead, high, but not the highest she had felt, and counted the child's breaths against her own pulse. 8 in 15 seconds. Not enough to be a crisis, not nothing either. She stood and said, clearly and without softness, she needed 2 women who could follow exact instruction without asking why. She needed every window cracked 2 fingers width, no more and no less. She needed 3 large pots on the stove, and water from the covered barrel only, not the flooded ditch outside. She needed the linens, all of them, every rag and towel and makeshift bedding that had touched a sick child, pulled out into the yard to be boiled separately. And she needed room to move. For a moment no one moved. Then the blacksmith, standing just inside the door, said quietly that those sounded like reasonable instructions to him, and something in the room gave way. Not dramatically, just gave way. She unpacked the satchel on the teacher's desk. Quinine tin, tincture, linen roll, soap. The formulary, which she did not need to open because she had read it so many times the pages lived in her hands. She worked out the quinine in the margin of the teacher's attendance ledger. She would copy it properly later. Each child's weight estimated by bone and age, each dose measured with the smallest spoon she had asked one of the mothers to bring from home. It was not much, 11 children, and the tin only a quarter full. She had to make it last. She showed the women how, not told, showed. She took the first mother's hands in hers and guided them to fold the cloth correctly, to press without dragging, to hold it long enough to pull the heat without chilling. She had them count aloud with her. 1, 2, 3, 4, watching the child's chest. 5, 6, 7, 8. Counting made the terror manageable. Terror with a task attached to it became something else, not calm, but purposeful. And purpose was enough. It was nearly always enough. By midnight, the linens were boiling. By midnight, the windows were cracked, and the air inside had changed, freshened almost imperceptibly. By midnight, 6 of the mothers were pressing cloths with steady hands, counting to themselves in whispers, and watching her for what to do next. She did not sleep. That was the first thing the women noticed, somewhere in the gray hours before dawn. That she had not sat down, not closed her eyes, not leaned against a single wall for more than a moment before she was moving again. There was always a cloth to turn, a child to check, a forehead to press the back of her hand against. She moved through the room like a woman who had been here before. Because she had. The merchant's wife appeared in the doorway just after first light. She did not knock. She did not enter. She simply stood at the threshold with her hands folded at her waist and her eyes traveling across the room in a slow, measuring arc, across the rows of sleeping children, the steaming basin in the corner, the mothers crouched at bedsides with damp cloths in their hands. Her gaze landed last on the woman who stood at the center of it all. It stayed there. Nothing passed between them. No nod, no word, no acknowledgement. The merchant's wife turned and walked back out into the pale morning, and the air in the doorway settled again, as though she had never been. The woman did not watch her go. She was already turning back to the fourth bed from the door, where a boy of perhaps 7 had begun to shift and moan in a way that tightened something in her chest. By mid-morning his fever had climbed past what the cool cloths could answer. She went for the willow bark tincture. She had measured its use carefully, 4 doses, perhaps 5 if she was strict. And she stood for a moment with the small brown bottle in her hand, weighing what she knew. Then she uncorked it, and did not second-guess herself again. She measured the dose against the boy's weight and age, tipped it carefully against his lips, and began the waterwork. Slow, patient. Cloth after cloth wrung out and laid along his neck and wrists, changed before it could warm. She counted her breaths instead of seconds. It gave her something to anchor to. The blacksmith had come back at sundown the night before and taken a quiet post near the door. He did not interfere. He brought a bucket of cold water from the well without being asked and set it beside her without a word. That was all she needed from him. The boy's fever did not break easily. It crested and held, and she worked against it through the full length of the afternoon and into the dark, methodical and unrattled, her hands never shaking even when her arms ached from the wringing. The mothers in the room watched her the way men watch a river when they need to know which way it's running. By early morning, the boy's breathing had changed. Slower, deeper. The small chest rising and falling in something closer to peace than labor. His skin, when she pressed the back of her hand to his temple, had lost its terrible dry heat. She wrung out a fresh cloth and laid it across his brow anyway. The morning of the third day came in gently, the way mornings sometimes do after hard nights, not triumphant, just quieter. The rain had slowed to a thin mist. Outside the schoolhouse windows, the water still stood in the low places, gray and wide as a shallow lake, but it had stopped climbing the legs of the fence posts. She noticed that. She noticed it the way you notice a fever that has finally held steady. Not gone, but no longer chasing you. The boy slept on, his breathing even and deep. It was the girl in the third cot who asked for bread. She said it plainly, in the small, clear voice of a child who has been very sick and is now simply hungry, "I would like some bread, please." Her mother, who had not left her side in 2 days, pressed both hands over her mouth. The sound she made was not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob, but something in between, something that belonged entirely to the relief of hearing your child want something ordinary again. Several of the other mothers looked up. One of them smiled without meaning to. The room, which had been holding itself rigid for 3 days, exhaled. She found half a loaf in the basket someone had left the day before, and cut the girl a small, careful slice. She watched the child eat it slowly, her color still pale, but her eyes tracking, present, her own again. The blacksmith arrived mid-morning with a pot of soup. Venison, from the smell of it, with onion and dried herb. He carried it the way a large man carries a delicate thing, with unnecessary care, and set it on the stove without ceremony. She almost sent it away. There was work yet. There were still 11 charges under her watch, still 2 with fevers that had not fully yielded. But he had already ladled a cup and held it out to her, and she was tired enough and human enough to take it. She stood at the window with the cup in both hands and drank it slowly. The soup was plain and good. Outside, a crow landed on the fence rail and considered the standing water with great seriousness before deciding against it and lifting away. The water had stopped rising. She was certain of that now. It had stopped, and that meant, in some number of days, 3, 4, 5, she could not know yet, it would begin to recede. The bridge was still gone. The road was still impassable. The doctor was still 7 miles south and unreachable. But the water had stopped rising, and 3 days remained on her supply of quinine if she rationed carefully, and the girl in the third cot had eaten her bread down to the crust. She finished the soup, handed the cup back. Behind her, one of the other children stirred and murmured something, and she turned from the window and went back to work. There was still so much of it left to do. The 4th day came in gray and cold, a low sky pressing down on the settlement like a held breath. She woke before the children did, which she always managed. Though she could not have explained how, some part of her had learned to sleep in slivers. 20 minutes here, half an hour there, and to surface fully alert, as if sleep were simply a brief negotiation with her body that she won by small margins. She went down the row of cots in the half-dark and pressed the back of her hand to each small forehead, counting. Fevers still present, but none higher than the night before. That was something, that was enough to keep moving. Then she opened her supply kit and counted what remained of the quinine. She did it twice, slowly, tipping the tin to catch the early light from the east window. The powder that remained would stretch 2 more days if she kept the doses exactly as she had been measuring them. If she pulled back slightly, a half measure for the children whose fevers had softened, perhaps 3. She sat with that arithmetic for a long moment. Then she opened her notebook and began to write. The blacksmith arrived with the dawn, as he had each morning, quiet as a man who understood the value of not needing to be told where to stand. He watched her work the entries into the notebook, each child's name recorded only by initial and cot number, per her practice, with dosage, time, temperature approximation, and response noted in a small, even hand. He said nothing, but she was aware of his attention the way one is aware of a steady lamp, not intrusive, simply there. She tore a page from the back of the notebook, blank, reserved for this kind of errand, and wrote out what she needed. Willow bark, dried or fresh, any quantity. Every house, every cabinet, every barn store, anything. She handed it to him. He read it once, folded it once, and was out the door without asking a single question. That was the thing about him. He had learned from somewhere or something in his past that action is its own form of trust. She did not expect much. Willow bark was not a staple most households kept to hand, and she had already mentally prepared to manage without it. So, the first surprise was the woman from the blue house at the end of the main road, who, arrived 40 minutes later with a cloth sack of dried bark she had been keeping against rheumatism. The second surprise was the farmer's wife, who sent her husband with a bundle tied in brown paper, enough for a solid tincture if she steeped it properly. The third was the old man from the edge of town, who simply appeared in the doorway, holding a tin box, said nothing at all, set it on the table, and left. She stood looking at what had accumulated on the table beside her kit. The town had not decided to help. It had simply, quietly, started. The fifth day arrived the way hard days often do. Quietly, without announcement, as though it had been waiting just outside the door and simply stepped in when no one was looking. She had slept perhaps 2 hours. She knew this because the coal oil lamp had burned down to its last quarter-inch of fuel, and she had been meaning to trim it since midnight. There was always something more pressing than the lamp. There always would be. 8 of the 11 children had broken their fevers. The other 3 were holding, not climbing, not falling, simply holding, which was its own kind of mercy. She had learned long ago that a fever that holds is a fever that is thinking. You wait it out. You keep the linens cool and the room aired, and you do not panic, because panic is a kind of fever itself, and it spreads faster than any the body makes on its own. She was wringing a cloth over the basin when she heard the sound. Not a knock, exactly. More the hesitation before a knock, the particular silence of a hand raised, and then not brought down, and then, finally, brought down once. Lightly, she dried her hands on her apron and went to the door. The merchant's wife stood on the step. She was dressed well, as she always was, but her hair had come partly loose, and she was holding a child against her chest, the way women hold children when they are frightened. Not tenderly, but fiercely, as though possession itself could protect. The girl was perhaps 6 years old. Her face was flushed the deep, particular red of a fever climbing hard, and she lay limp against her mother's shoulder, her breathing audible, her small fingers slack. The merchant's wife said nothing. She did not offer an explanation, or an apology, or any of the words that might have been said. She simply stood in the doorway and looked at her, and the look held everything the silence did not say. The months have turned shoulders. The whispered accusations kept alive past any useful purpose. And now this, the moment where all of that met the fever in a child's face and broke apart like river ice. She did not make her say anything. She stepped forward and took the girl from her arms, calmly, the way she had taken every child, not gently, but surely, with the practiced certainty of hands that knew what they were doing. She turned without a word and carried the girl to the cleanest cot, the one she had reserved against exactly this kind of need, and laid her down and began at once. The assessment, the pulse, the temperature of skin against her wrist, the careful notation in the log. The work was the answer. It had always been the answer. Every argument she had never made, every defense she had never given, all of it was here, in these hands, doing this. Behind her she heard the door close softly. The 6th day came in quietly. No crisis announced it, no child's breathing turned sharp in the night, no sudden spike of heat that required her to move fast through the dark with the willow bark tincture and a wet cloth. The morning simply arrived, pale and unhurried, and she moved through the sick room, doing what she always did. The pulse, the temperature of skin, the notation in the log, and found, cot by cot, that the worst had already passed. 11 children. All of them breathing steadily, several of the older ones awake enough to be restless, which was its own kind of good news. The merchant's wife's daughter she checked last, though not because she had been neglected. She had been watched as closely as any of them, more closely perhaps, because the mother had arrived on the 5th night, with that wordless capitulation still raw in the air between them, and she had understood, without being told, what that kind of surrender costs. The girl was stable by midday. By nightfall her color had changed. the high, dangerous flush cooling to something merely tired. And she was asking for water in a voice, small enough to be ordinary, which was the finest sound in the world. She wrote it all in the log. She always wrote it all. When the last of the lamps had been turned down and the volunteer mothers were settled into their night watch chairs, she took her coat from the peg by the door and went outside. The air was cool and clean in the way that spring air gets after a long wet week. The mud still present, the standing water still silvering the low places across the road, but something shifted in the smell of it, some loosening. She sat on the schoolhouse step and let her shoulders drop. Her mule stood at the fence post, not 6 feet away, hip cocked, eyes mostly closed, ears barely moving. He had been there most of the day. He was always there. She did not feel triumph. She had learned long ago that triumph was a dangerous thing to reach for, because it required a future she could not yet see. What she felt instead was steadiness, the particular quiet steadiness of a person who has done the work that was in front of them, and done it right, and now rests not in relief, but in the simple fact of having held 6 days, 6 nights, 11 children who had arrived burning and are now cooling towards sleep. She leaned her head back against the door frame and looked at the sky, which was clearing in the west, the cloud cover thinning out to show a strip of deep, darkening blue. The mule exhaled through his nose, long and slow, and she listened to that sound the way she would have listened to good counsel. Somewhere to the south, 7 miles away, and still unreachable, the road was waiting to dry. She woke before first light to the sound of her mule moving, not in distress, but with purpose, shifting his weight and turning his head south, ears forward, the way he did when he sensed something coming that she could not yet see. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. The blacksmith appeared in the schoolhouse doorway a few minutes later, his big frame filling it, and he did not have to say much. "The water," he told her, "it's dropping. Could be a man on a horseback, could get through by mid-morning if he pushed." She nodded and thanked him, and he went back to his post among the sleeping children, and she sat down at the small table by the window with her formulary notebook and a stub of pencil and got to work. The log had been running for 6 days. She had kept it in fragments, a line here, a note there, scratched down between one child's cooling cloth and the next child's quinine dose. Now she pulled every scrap together and began to write it clean. She wrote in her clearest hand, the one she had practiced as a girl when her father told her that a record kept sloppily was a record that would be disbelieved. Each child's name, the day and approximate hour they were brought in, the presenting temperature as best she could judge it, and the method she used to judge. The doses given, and the intervals. The crises. And there had been crises. 2 children whose fevers had spiked so high she had kept cold compresses rotating through the night on their small heads. And the interventions, and the outcomes. She left nothing out. Not the moment she had run low on quinine and stretched the doses with willow bark tincture and prayer. Not the child who had stopped drinking and had to be coaxed through a full hour, teaspoon by teaspoon. Not the one who had cried for her mother so steadily and so long that Clara had finally sat beside her and held her hand and simply waited with her in the crying until it spent itself. It was nearly full light when she finished. Outside, the mule had settled again, head low, placid as ever, though his ears still pointed south. She read the log through once, slowly, correcting 2 words and clarifying a margin note. Then she closed the notebook and set it at the center of the table, where it could not be missed. Around her, the children slept. Their breathing was even. The room smelled of lye soap and wood smoke and the faint, herbal sharpness of willow bark. A thin, clean light was beginning to come through the eastern windows, and it fell across the rows of small, blanketed forms with something close to gentleness. She put the pencil down She stood and straightened her back and went to check on the last child, because the work was not finished until the work was finished. She heard the hoofbeats before the others did. The mule heard them first, his ears swiveled south, and he lifted his head with the slow, deliberate attention of an old animal who has learned that not every sound is worth alarm. But this one was. She was at the window before the rider came into view, and when he did, she recognized the shape of him against the brightening road, the doctor's black coat, his bay horse picking carefully through the last of the standing water, mud to the stirrups, but moving. She stepped back from the window and let him come. He came into the schoolhouse still pulling off his gloves, his boots dark with mud, and he stopped just inside the door and looked at the room. The rows of sleeping children, the clean linens, the stove burning low and steady, the blacksmith sitting in the corner chair with his big hands open in his lap. The assembled mothers who had come at first light without being asked stood along the far wall. The merchant's wife stood among them, her child asleep, in the third row. The doctor picked up the notebook from the center of the table. He read it the way a man reads something that surprises him. Slowly, going back, he turned pages. He read a margin note twice. The room was very quiet, except for the small sounds of sleeping children and the occasional settling of the fire. When he finished, he looked up. He said, plainly and without preamble, that the records before him were meticulous, that the dosing was correct, that the quarantine protocol was sound, that the fever management, the cool cloths, the timed quinine, the rationed willow bark, was precisely what he would have ordered, and in at least 2 cases, the notes suggested a judgment that had almost certainly saved the child's life. He said he could not have done better himself. He said that whoever had managed this outbreak had saved every life in that room, and that he intended to say so to anyone who asked. He did not perform it. He simply said it, and then he set the notebook back down with care. The women who had once refused to meet her eyes now looked at her, not with warmth yet. That would take longer, and she knew it, and she was not in a hurry, but they looked. The foreman came forward from the doorway where he had been standing and asked, quietly, whether she would consider staying on. She was already moving. The last child, the smallest one, the one who had cried the longest, had shifted in her sleep and pushed her blanket aside. Clara crossed the room and smoothed it back over her, tucking the edge with 2 sure fingers. Then she straightened, and she gave one small, unhurried nod. Outside, the mule blinked in the new morning sun. The mud was beginning to dry. The road